Sean Evers, and very pleased to do so. We have seen a week of intense action in Ukraine and elsewhere. We've seen evidence of brutal war crimes in Bucha and other places in Ukraine, hectic activity in European energy markets as it approaches make up your mind time in the continent's dealings in energy with Russia, I think. I detect some feeling that there's a much more aggressive stance is required by the EU against Putin, especially given the shocking evidence of war crimes that we've seen. The Economist front page last weekend led with a headline, "Why Ukraine Must Win," based on an interview with Volodymyr Zelensky, which is a pretty strong statement of intent, I think. At the end of all that, and after the release of the first tranche of barrels from the SPR, Brent was down roughly 10% on the week, just above 100 this morning, 101. So, Dr. Carol Knackley, CEO of Crystal Energy, please give us your situation report on the week past, if you would, and put it into a broader macro context. We've seen more signs from the Fed that it's preparing for aggressive action against inflation via further interest rates. Put all that into some order, please, Carol.
Good morning, Frank. Good morning, everyone. Well, I wish I could put some order to a very chaotic situation. But what I can say at this stage, when I look at the news, for example, over the last few days, it reminds me a little bit of the wartime in Lebanon, when very little was happening at a time when there were no peace agreements. And that was simply a sign that the worst was yet to come, because that's when you would prepare for more aggressive attacks. So you start to reinforce the protection of your house. You try to get some supplies for the next few days. So I just fear whether in this situation where not much has happened on the ground, on the military side, whether there's something like a big surprise is going to be ahead of us in the coming days and week, and more aggressive stance from Russia in the Ukraine. So that's on the geopolitical front. And it's like a catch-up game, because whenever the situation escalates in the Ukraine, then we see the Western powers and international powers imposing or unfolding a new layer of sanctions, as we saw yesterday with the United States. On the economic front, you mentioned the Fed. So you have on the economic front something that has been happening before the war, only to be, if you want, accelerated by the war in Ukraine. And that is primarily the problem of inflation, which was the result of all the policies that happened to tackle COVID-19, and then the supply chain bottlenecks, and you had all these commodity price increases, only to be exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. And that's why I'm not surprised to see the Fed taking almost, on a regular basis, they are telling you unfold the sanctions, they are unfolding, not surprising, but at least expected and more aggressive policies to tame inflation, which is becoming increasingly burdensome. So you have two fronts which are to some extent connected. What's happening on the geopolitical front, again, nobody knows how long will that last and how worse the situation can get. Each day you think that it got worse, it couldn't get any worse, and it gets worse. So we don't know how far that will go. We don't know how far the sanctions will go. In relevance to energy markets, so far the sanctions continue to shield or to protect oil and gas exports from Russia. And that's why we continue to see these additional revenues flowing to the Russian economies and supporting the ruble. And this can send signals that the sanctions may not be effective, but it's a different story. And at the same time, you have on the macro side, central banks in particular in major economies, especially in the US, are taking tougher stance on inflation. How all this will work out in the next few months or towards the end of the year, my guess is that as good as yours, but I'm not that optimistic about the economic outlook.
Right. I want to drill down a bit deeper into the whole question of European sanctions and rubleization a bit later, if you don't mind. But on inflation, do you think now, given the fact that the war has massively exacerbated the global inflation problem, does the Fed have enough ammunition in its armory now, looking at the rest of the year?
Well, we would like to hope so. I mean, the Fed, they have capable people and they have seen this is coming, and they're not really shocking the market because you don't want to cause any further volatility. So they have been preparing the market and investors about what is going, but there is always a risk of them getting it wrong because, mind you, there are lots of people who blame the Fed for coming a bit too late and acknowledging the inflation problem too late. But at least they are taking some actions. They are saying that we have the remedy for the problem. Whether they will succeed or not, I think it remains to be seen.
Right. Richard Rodolio, CEO of Matrix Global Holdings over there in California. How does it look from the forecourts of sunny Southern California? I was there a couple of weeks ago, and it hit $6.50 a gallon, which absolutely shocked my daughter when she was filling the car up. But how is it now? And what are people there making of President Biden's energy policy overall in the face of Russian aggression?
I think they're calling the energy crisis a Putin price hike. That is the going phrase now in the States. Realize California is the highest priced gasoline in the country by a fair margin, partly due to higher state taxes, but also due to the reformulated gasoline that California uses for pollution control. So it's a good $1 to $1.25 higher than the rest of the country. But the policy of Biden, and really not just Biden, but just the policies that have been put in place here in the United States over the past number of years are kind of coming home to roost. There was on Capitol Hill today, the CEOs of Chevron, Exxon, and Shell were brought to task by the ranking members and accused of gouging and price gouging, given the fact of what's happened to gasoline prices. What is ironic is these are the same House of Representative members who last year, almost to the date, were calling for the reduction of fracking and how fracking was destroying the environment in the United States. At the same time, we saw the stopping of the Keystone Pipeline. So you have these kind of push-pull going on, and it's remarkable. I think it's remarkable that there is really no adults in the room. There is nobody who has a real sense of what true economics are and what supply-demand really means when you cut off supply at the margin. And so the United States is caught between its desire to become a beacon of green policy, but at the same time, it realizes that gasoline prices at the pump this high are going to be a political cost. And what Carol just said about the Fed getting it right, it's going to be very interesting to see what the Fed does. As they raise interest rates, they cause the stock market to fall, and we see gasoline prices almost moving to a stagflation type approach. What are the politicians going to do as we come into the end of the year, which is really the next kind of big political elections that we're having in November? So at this point in time, the United States is caught, and it was on display today, where the government was chastising the oil companies for gouging, while at the same time wanting them to be net zero by 2050, I think is the going phrase. Yeah.
Richard, the oil and gas CEOs who are being grilled, they tried to make the point that, of course, it's markets that set energy prices, gas prices, ultimately. Do you think that two vital constituencies understand that? One, the White House, and two, the American public.
It's hard to believe what the American public believes. I have friends who are doctors and lawyers, and I scratch my head sometimes trying to explain the fundamentals of oil. And I've talked about, before we even got to there, I thought we'd be at $100 without a Ukrainian war, and trying to talk about the marginal barrel of supply and what does that mean, and what does OPEC plus mean, and how does that work in a rising demand. I don't know, Frank. I don't know what goes through people's head as it relates to why prices are doing what they're doing. To me, it's obvious. It's a supply-demand function, full stop. It always has been. And the real key factor here, which goes back to my kind of look at this over a long time, is that OPEC Plus got it right. They're in control, and that is the way it's going to go. When the president of the United States calls the leader of Saudi Arabia a pariah state and a killer, at the same time works with the Iranians towards the agreement that's not going to go down, one wonders why OPEC even pays attention to him. And I think that's really what we find. And I think the American people are getting wise to it.
Right. He's having a hard time walking back from that pariah comment, isn't he?
Yes.
Charles Elinas, CEO, Cyprus Natural Hydrocarbons, normally based in Nicosia, but currently in The Hague. Charles, and I know you were last week in the Middle East for the Atlantic Council meetings. But let me ask you about Cyprus, because it strikes me that there are some interesting factors in common with Dubai, where I am at the moment, and Cyprus. Cyprus, of course, a member of the EU. It has implemented some pretty strong actions against Russian banks and Russian entrepreneurs on the islands. But much like Dubai, where I am, I suspect there are still plenty of Russians there in Cyprus, living there, doing business. What's the feeling amongst Cypriots? Are they willing to make sacrifices in economic terms and in their living standards in order to punish Putin?
Well, I mean, Cyprus has been very close to Russia for many decades. But, like Greece, all countries are Orthodox Christians, and they share a long history of cooperation. In Cyprus, as you said, Russia had a massive influence, still has a massive influence in terms of presence. I mean, for example, Limassol, the second biggest city in Cyprus, is considered to be a little Moscow because of the number of Russians living there. Cyprus has taken action, at last has taken action against Russia, supporting European sanctions. But to a certain extent, it's paying the price. I mean, the Russian ambassador in Cyprus actually went wild and went public attacking Cyprus for its actions, and now has left. But also the result.
He left voluntarily, did he? He
did,
wasn't
yes.
asked to leave, yeah?
No, he left voluntarily. I don't know what happened behind the scenes, but he certainly left. But the impact of all of that is that it is impacting the economy of Cyprus in the sense that there is still a lot of Russian money, not just Russians in Cyprus, a lot of Russian money in the economy. Some of it is getting out. But also the fact that about a fifth of the tourists that come to Cyprus, and tourism is quite critical to the economy, are Russians. And it looks likely and now that isn't going to happen. So this year, the government is panicking about that factor. In terms of the impact on the cost of living and on life in Cyprus, actually it's small because Cyprus energy is still oil-driven, and oil prices were high before Ukraine and continue to be high anyway. So the problem has been there for a while because of the high oil prices. There is no gas yet in Cyprus, and as a result, it is not felt as much. So if you go there, Ukraine is part of the news, but it's not at the top of the list. There is concern. There is Cypriots see what is happening in Ukraine, similar to what happened to them when Turkey invaded Cyprus, and draw parallels, and often get upset when everybody talks about Ukraine, but nobody said anything about Turkey. But it's a fact of life.
Right.
The region in general, I mean, Greece is also having problems now because of the action it took against Russia, expelling diplomats, and it's affecting Greek politics as well. So there is an impact on the region, but actually it's not very strong. The country that is benefiting from this, to a certain extent, is Turkey, because Turkey is acting as a mediator and it gets a lot of kudos out of it. And also it demonstrates its importance to NATO. I mean, for example, in Washington now, they're talking about the need to supply Turkey with F-16s. That a few months ago, that was impossible. In addition to that, quite a few of the oligarchs are moving their yachts, for example.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the tourism that may not be coming to Cyprus, if they go anywhere, it may go to Turkey. So Turkey is coming out of it in a good way. Yeah,
that's a triangle. Cyprus, Greece, Turkey.
Yes.
Tell me, you said that the Russian money has left, but here in Dubai, we've also seen an influx of a different kind of Russian money. Is this a net outflow in Cyprus?
There is a net outflow because the kind of people, the kind of Russians that come to Dubai are not coming to Cyprus. Cyprus is taking, because of the position it has taken within the EU, supporting the EU line, and the fact that the ambassador saw Cyprus as not quite the enemy, but an adverse, not supporting Russia. That means that those Russians who are looking for a home prefer Dubai than Cyprus, despite the fact that there is a large number of Russians living there.
Okay. I was interested to read the developments. I am a citizen of Ireland, of the Irish Republic, and I don't know whether you saw during the week that the Russian embassy in Dublin has been virtually blockaded. They won't deliver fuel, water, and it almost seems as if they're trying to starve them out, which is a popular action rather than a diplomatic action. Anyway, just by the by, let's go back to some oil market fundamentals. Last week, we saw OPEC Plus sticking to its line that it was all down to, that the recent volatility was all down to geopolitics. But many experts view this as a convenient way of passing the buck for lack of action by OPEC Plus to increase output. Carol, what do you think? Can this horizon move anytime in the next 6 months when the OPEC Plus deal will end?
For the OPEC Plus, I'm still trying to get my head around their logic, because I can see different points of the arguments made. That if you look at OPEC Plus, at least publicly made statements, they say that so far there are no supply disruptions, and they are concerned also about a demand outlook and macroeconomic outlook, and that the market should trust them, that they would step in if needed. But at the same time, if I look at their raison d'etre and their mission statements, they say that they are committed to market stability. They are committed to, and their objective was to bring down OECD commercial inventories to the 5 years average. And then you see their monthly reports, though we are yet to see their latest one. You can see there is some kind of conflicting views here, because we do have, the inventories are well below their 5 years average. So we have this drawdown, which means that mission has been accomplished. And that even though that there may not have been like supply cuts, we saw that traders have been shying away from Russian oil and looking for alternatives. And also the market at where the levels where it is today, I'm not quite sure whether this is the kind of stability that consumers would like to see. So you would expect, when you put all these pieces together, you would expect the OPEC Plus to maybe take some additional steps, and then just to honor its commitment to market stability, unless they believe that market stability at $100+ a barrel is acceptable, actually what the market needs today. Well, look, at the end, there will be two things that will drive OPEC to deviate from its strategy at the moment. Historically, it has been political pressure, and at this stage, we can see that there is a lot of bargaining power being exercised when it comes to the political front. The relationship between the US and OPEC de facto leader, Saudi Arabia, is not really at its best. And they are trying to, at least the Saudis are trying to score some points on other important issues before coming to the rescue of the American consumers, even though the US is also benefiting from higher prices because they are the largest producer in the world, and are also benefiting from high gas prices because they're sending their LNG to Europe and committing even more so. And there is also the other factor, which is more related to the fundamentals, that is demand destruction, that usually OPEC responds to demand destruction. That, however, always comes at a later stage, because by the time we realize that demand destruction has actually happened, it becomes too late. And that's why you usually see a collapse in prices after a certain period of high prices or spikes in prices. So on balance, so far, we don't see a major deviation in their policy, especially if you add on top of that the addition in the strategic petroleum reserves released by the US, by the IEA, then OPEC has additional reason to hold on to its policy. But I think when we see, we'll have to see more signs of physical supply disruptions to drive OPEC to put more barrels, or if we have demand destruction, then that will drive OPEC in the opposite direction.
Richard, how do Americans see OPEC Plus now? You touched on this before. But there's been lots of talk recently about diplomatic and political rupture between the USA, Saudi Arabia, the pariah comment. What's your sense on this? Has the war in Ukraine changed US Mideast relations forever, do you think?
I don't think the normal US person in the United States does not think about OPEC. I think maybe on the coast there's a thought about OPEC. There's a thought when they look at the price, and there's a thought of a politician says something. But I think OPEC is kind of by the wayside right now. I think Ukraine is a greater focus. You know, one of the things that we continue to see is this idea of how are we transitioning? What is this transition going to be? I think what I just noticed today, Platts had a price. Jet fuel in New York Harbor was $7.63, and so the question really is going to be is, what's the effect on demand? I think Carol made a very good point about demand. One thing I could think about demand, and maybe how it's changed here in the past 4 or 5 years, is information technology has moved so radically and has increased so fast. I wonder, Carol, if we're going to see that demand function change, but we're going to see it change in real time. And with OPEC Plus meetings happening monthly instead of quarterly, which has always been the case up until in the last year or two, is the ability of OPEC Plus to adjust their supply in real time to real-time changes in demand going to change the way the prices react? Because I think right now we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know where prices are going. Prices are moving $5 a day. The increase of margin cost by the banks has caused traders to significantly reduce their positions. When you significantly reduce your positions, you reduce liquidity, which increases volatility. We do have this new increase in or decrease in demand, which could be coming. But again, it's the same kind of thing. Are we seeing that in real time? Something interesting. I don't want to jump over to Europe, but I just came back from the Platts storage and middle distillate conferences, and I found them to be really interesting. And my two key takeaways were: one, there was this, even in the middle of all this, and maybe because the presentations had already been written, but the glowing conversations about green and blue hydrogen and renewable diesel. That was the one. The second one was that the large money banks were not changing their tune. They are going to go towards ESG and working on those policies. And in my experience, whenever we've experienced high prices like this, going back over the decades, there's always been a supply response that comes from the banks. Well, if the banks aren't there to do that, what's going to happen? Are we going to see this kind of perpetual supply-demand balance that we never really catch up? What happens when demand next year, if it gets there, is 104 million barrels a day or 103 million barrels a day? Where are those barrels going to come from? Because I think we might all agree that it's going to be tough for Russia to come back to 11 or 12 million barrels. Sure. So that's really a question I think we have to ask ourselves.
Richard, you brought us to Europe. Let's stay there for a while, shall we? Charles, you are normally in the hotly contested Eastern Mediterranean, which I guess is almost Europe, or mainly Europe. You know, what does it all look like for you from there? Some so-called experts have said that the invasion of Ukraine is all a power play by Russia to get its hands on new energy sources in Ukraine and the Eastern Mediterranean, the Black Sea. What's your view on those kind of notions?
I think Europe is caught in between somewhere. Europe feels the need to respond to the war in Ukraine, and it does so often without thinking the consequences. And sanctions are coming one on top of the other, but the impact of these sanctions is probably stronger on Europeans than on Russians. And I say that because if you compare oil and gas prices now to a year ago, their oil prices are about twice as much and gas prices are about 5-6 times as much. So in effect, even with sanctions and the reduction in exports, Russia is still making more money, a lot more money out of oil and gas than it was making a year ago. And you really need to cut exports to nothing before Russia suffers, which is not possible. In Europe, prices are going up everywhere. I mean, the last this week in the UK, prices went up by well over 50% of energy, and the same is happening in the rest of Europe. But at the moment, Europeans in general are abhorred about what is happening in Ukraine, and they see this as a necessary step to be taken. But the question is for how long? Right. For example, in France, you have probably noticed that Marine Le Pen is getting closer to Macron, and the presidential elections are only a week away.
Right.
Why is that happening? And if Macron is being so active in trying to help the situation in Ukraine, why is that happening? And to a certain extent, it's because of the cost of energy of energy to people. It's exorbitant. It's having massive effect on life, but also on goods and everything else in Europe.
Okay, that seems the perfect occasion to pull up the question for the audience today, if you could please, because Charles, you segued into that seamlessly. Thank you for that. So the question today is: in the cause of solidarity with Ukraine, Europe should refuse to pay Russia in rubles for energy. Choose one of these three. I strongly agree. I believe there are too many economic and financial hurdles, or I strongly disagree. What are the practicalities there, Richard? You know, do you think that European citizens are willing to take a severe hit to their standards of living in order to punish Russia and support Ukraine?
A good question. I mean, it really comes back, and Dr. Charles just said it. It comes back to the ballot box. What are you going to do with the politicians who put you in the situation in the first place? You know, I saw today from Gulf Intelligence, British government is going to launch oil and gas projects in the North Sea with bespoke support. Germany is now closing, it's reopening coal and nuclear plants that were forced to reopen after going over years of deciding that they're going to use Russian natural gas. You know, if government leaders were oil traders and they were forced to live with the decisions that they have and made, they would have bankrupted their companies and they would have been fired. So how do you get fired if you're a politician? There's only one way: you get voted out. And I think the decisions made by the governments across the spectrum are wrong, and they put their people in harm's way. What will they do? I don't know.
Right. Carol, I guess Germany is key to this question, isn't it? What Germany decides to do. We've seen some breaking of ranks in Europe. Hungary and Slovakia, I believe, have said that they will consider paying in rubles. But what will Germany do? I know that you have spent some time in Germany recently. What will Germany do?
Germans, when they decide something, they stick to it based on my experience dealing with people there. But look, I mean, they are coming from one perspective that they are using the legal requirements, so they are sticking to that, and they say any deviation from the currency stipulated in the contract would require really a renegotiation of the contract. So that's why they say that, of course, there is a political driver behind it, but they are so far standing by what was signed in the contracts and what is stipulated in the contract, that the currency is not going to be ruble, anything but not ruble, whatever is stipulated in the contract. I mean, if they really want, I mean, if Europe is desperate and they really need that gas, they will find a way to pay it in rubles. So it's not, I think the technical and the financial hurdles that whatever were mentioned before, they can be overcome if they really want to deviate from that. But so far, I think this is coming more with a political message. So far, what we heard from Russia has been more threats. So they haven't acted on their threats. They've been threatening to cut supplies, but they haven't done so. And this is where, and Europe also has been shying away from sanctioning gas exports coming from Russia. So in this case, really, it's like a game of chicken, but I think Germans, they are likely to stick to their point, at least for the time being.
Right, right.
Can I add something?
The poll result, please.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, we have to be careful in the sense that what the edict that Putin issued states that payments will continue being made in dollars and in euros to Gazprom, but each company will have a dual account paying in euros. The money will then be converted into rubles, and that will pay Gazprom for the gas. And as a result of that, I mean, the French ecology minister actually said last week that maybe it wouldn't be a problem. And both the French and the German economy ministers came back and said they're looking into that. The companies themselves, like OMV, Uniper, and Eni, are not taking an outright negative view. They're saying they're looking into that.
Right.
And I won't be surprised if this mechanism, which allows payments to be made actually in euros and dollars before they're converted to rubles, is accepted. It's
right.
Sort of tacitly, at least they allow the companies to accept it if they want to.
Okay. So there are ways around it, but I guess the end result is that Putin continues to receive funds for his war machine. Just on the poll results, I'm not quite sure what this is telling us, because more than half of people strongly agree that we should not pay in rubles, while 45%, sizable chunk, think that there are too many economic and financial hurdles to not pay in rubles, basically. So there we are. Well, look, thank you, the three of you, Carol, Richard, Charles. A really interesting week yet again. I'm sure next week will be just as interesting. And Gulf Intelligence will be back on Sunday, the beginning of the Gulf Intelligence Week. GI hasn't gone with the new UAE weekend yet, maybe under consideration. But I'm sure that next week will be just as fascinating and action-packed as this was. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.